City Club members are about to hear today about Asian business cultures and how they compare to the U.S. and Australia. Dr. Moni Lai Storz is Senior Lecturer in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Monash University, Melbourne, Australia, where she also received her PhD. During the 20 years that she's been teaching, Dr. Storz has gained extensive research experience in Asia and Australia. She's drawn on this to design and develop programs in Australia and overseas for both the private and public sectors. As an education and management consultant to industry and government bodies, Dr. Storz specializes in stress management, associated learning, cross-cultural communication, and negotiation skills. Dr. Storz is the principal of Cross-Cultural Management Consultants. The organization runs training programs on cross-cultural communication and negotiation skills for companies and government organizations. It also provides a briefing service to our individuals who require cross-cultural communication in Asia. Presumably, she will increase our cultural competency today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Moni Lai Storz.
Thank you, Mary. That was a really, really long introduction, and I must say I'm sorry that you have to put up with it. So I'm really, really happy to be here, ladies and gentlemen. And for those of you who are not here in this room and you're listening wherever you are, in your car, in your living room while you're playing with the cat, I want to say hello. You are with me in this room. Before I go any further, I would like to thank a number of very, very important American friends of mine. I would first of all like to thank, of course, Nancy Hedin of the City Club of Portland. And I would also like to thank very much with my heart Guadalupe Guarjado and Cliffy Jones of Technical Assistance, Community Services, and last but not least, Kathleen Herron of Tools for Diversity for making my trip to Portland possible. And for all of you, my American friends, I also like to say how important you are to me here, because if you're not here today, I will not be here either. All right. Last week, the Sunday Oregonian featured in their business page the Asia's economic age. I read that your President Clinton will be meeting with APEC leaders in Seattle. And poor little Portland has somehow missed out in hosting this summit meeting that would put you on the map. And my poor little heart thought, oh, I like you so much. Then I said, but somehow I don't think Portland has really missed out, because you've got me instead. And I'm here, and I'm real. Well, I'm not as handsome as your president, but I'm certainly different. And definitely a true blue representative of the Asia-Pacific Rim. Let me tell you, I was born in Muslim Malaysia of Chinese parents. I went to Australia as an Asian student, and I now live in Australia and commute between Asia and Australia for work and for play, because I still have a mother in Malaysia. And today I am in Portland, Oregon, USA. So it's really beaut, as the Aussies would say. So I'm really happy, really happy to be here. Now, on a more serious note, I really don't think Portland will miss out on the phenomenal economic growth of the Asia Pacific, because some of you today will take up the challenge, and you have the resources, human and otherwise, to bring about a successful outcome. The fact that I'm standing here is an indication of your readiness and your courage to take up that challenge. When I got your warm invitation to speak, Nancy, I thought how brave you are, as you knew so little about me. For all you knew, I might not even speak American. And you were willing to entrust me to hundreds of listeners. I thank you for all of that, for the faith and the trust. In order to take up the challenge, and in order for me in some way to assist you, I would like to share some of my ideas with you today regarding Asia's business cultures. That is the area of my current research. That is the area where my psyche feels most comfortable. And what's more, it is the area where I feel really fun to do work in. So I'd like to share that with all of you today. Okay, first of all, it is important to note that Asia is not one country. It makes no sense to see an Asian and call that person Asian. Asia has more than 10 countries. Included in these countries are many diverse cultures and peoples. For example, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Thais, the Malays, the Filipinos, the Indonesians, the Indians, and I must mention these people, the Bruneians. I'm sure you don't know what that is. Some of you might, but a lot of you don't. The Bruneians are the people of Brunei, a small little country in the Pacific, but it is the richest country in the world. The Sultan of Brunei is the richest man in the world. Now, let me focus on the Chinese culture today. I think most Americans know a lot about Japanese culture because the Japanese people have come in to do business with you and vice versa. I like to focus on the Chinese culture today for a number of reasons, historical as well as in terms of its relevance. Let me give you just one or two statistics for the people who are left brain, the accountants and the people who are number crunchers. But for those of you who are more right brain and who deals with people more with your feelings, here we are. There are 51 million overseas Chinese. They are found all over the world, in New York, in Los Angeles, in Melbourne, as you call it, Vancouver, Canada, Singapore, Bangkok, Jakarta, and certainly in Portland. The second statistic I'd like to share with you, there are 1.15 billion people in mainland China alone. If all of you in this room, in little Portland, could just sell one little shoelace costing 1 American cent to 1.15 billion people, Portland will be rich. And there'll be many, many jobs for many, many people. And that's what I'm all about, creating jobs for people, and sharing the wealth of the earth. All right, another important reason why I have chosen Chinese culture to focus on today is because Chinese cultural influences are still found in different forms in many countries of Asia. For example, in Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and of course, what is generally known as Southeast Asia, including Thailand. I can't talk about all of Chinese culture, but if we could get some idea about the core or the main values of Chinese culture, we will also begin to understand that the peoples are diverse, and we have to understand that diversity if we want to do effective business, if we want to be friends with them, if we want to somehow create cooperation so that the earth is better for all of us and our children. Okay? Right. So I simply cannot stress how absolutely important the culture factor is in terms of doing international business. In terms of doing international business on a diverse range of issues, whether it is in training, in consulting, in lawyering, or simply in exporting goods and services. Cultural factors play a key part in marketing, in selling ourselves, in negotiations, in selling and in buying, in short, in all human interaction. And business is a form of human interaction. For some of you in this room, it is perhaps the most important one. Let me give you an example of how cultural factors play a part in international business. Recently in Australia, we have a program called Life Be In It. It is a fitness and health program. So as Australia focuses on the Asia-Pacific Rim, they wanted to sell this program to Malaysia. In one of the posters, as part of the whole marketing package, in one of the posters, it featured a nuclear family, a white family with mom and dad, 2.4 kids, and a little dog. And this focuses on the Australian value of family life. They send this package across, beautifully packaged for high corporate people. It was sent back by the Malaysian government. And we couldn't figure out why. And what it was this a poster. And what it was in the poster was a little dog. And the Malaysians objected to the little dog in the poster. And I will tell you why. Most people know that the Malays are Muslims and pork is forbidden in their culture. But what most people don't know is the dog is also considered unclean. By failing to understand that little bit of culture, the Australian government has started badly. What I'd like to do with you now is to help you understand a little bit about Chinese culture and to understand that we really have to understand what the Confucianist ethic is all about. There are other things in the Chinese culture, but if we can get that, I would have walked away with something that I've contributed to your understanding of the Chinese. Because the Confucianist ethic is what motivates the people consciously and subconsciously. One of the central notions within Confucianism is that a human being can be perfected through moral cultivation and learning. Of course, perfection being what it is, it can never be attained. To be a perfect human being, one also has to be humble and modest. This requirement means that one lives a frugal life. By working hard and living a frugal life leads inevitably to savings. Savings become investments and capital. This is very similar to something you already know as Americans. It's very similar to the Protestant ethic, is it not? So the underlying foundation of the Chinese culture is not that different from those which operate from the values of the Protestant ethic and its relationship to the spirit of modern capitalism. Another central notion of Confucianist teaching is learning how to be a human being. The term human being has no English equivalent. So I would just have to try and make you understand it within your own value framework. The closest equivalent to it perhaps is in the Christian notion of Christian fellowship. Is when you see another person, you recognize that the person is a human being like yourself, and you immediately know quite intuitively what it is to be good. In other words, to be human, to another being much like yourself. And it is in that sense that I can share with you what it means to be human in the Confucianist worldview. So the most insulting thing you can say to somebody else is, you don't know how to be a human being. And the most loving, most humane, most accepting thing you can say is, you know how to be a human being. Whether it is in business or in other relationships, when a Chinese or a person who comes from that sort of Confucianist value framework says to you, Tom, Peter, Jane, Mary, you really know how to be a human being. Well, you are part of the Christian sisterhood or brotherhood of man and woman. The Confucianist view of the self and learning how to be a human being is also important to an understanding of Chinese culture. I want to spend a few minutes here on the notion of the self. This sounds complicated to some of you, so I would like to have some of your attention here. What I'm going to explain is easier done if I got visuals and so on. So I'm just going to go a little bit slow and read this out to you, and then I will explain. The process of learning how to be a human being is centered on the self. This sounds rather selfish at first until we examine what the self is in the Confucianist view. Essentially, the self is surrounded by many layers. One of the ways of understanding this concept of the self is to visualize the self in the middle of an onion. In the middle of the onion is the self. So can you visualize that? So you're in the middle of this onion. So the person is surrounded by these many layers of onion. Each of these layers represents a group of people for the self in the middle. The first layer closest to the self is the family. Then comes the neighbors. Then the community. Then the society. And then the cosmos. Every time a layer is peeled off, the self encounters another layer, and another, and another. And so it goes on till after death, and you said, oh, thank goodness it's over. Nah. It's not over, because that's the universe, that is the cosmos. And that's why after death, we still worship our parents. And that's where ancestor worship comes from the Confucianist teachings. It is based on the notion, if thou should honor thy father and mother and thy ancestors in life, then thou should honor them after their death. So you see, the self as an individual in the American sense is forever connected with a group, either the family, the clan, the community, and so on and so forth. So this is the key difference between Western, in quotation marks, and Eastern cultures drawing from the Confucianist ethic. And this is the difference. The self, the individual, me, I as a Chinese person, has no existence without you, the other person. So my existence is not just codependent on you, it's just dialectically linked, connected with you in the most existential sense of the word. If you do not exist, my other fellow human being, I do not exist. If I hurt you, I hurt me, I hurt we. If I hurt myself, I hurt also you. So, for the peoples whose cultures have come from Chinese culture in relation to the concept of self, as I've explained to you, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Thais, and so on. These people's cultures are very much influenced not by individualism, but collectivism. For an American or an Australian, the person who stands up to be counted, the individual, the ones who dare stand up in this room now and say, Moni Storz, I don't care where you come from, but I disagree with what you have to say today. That is individualism. The challenge to be different. If you had said that to me, you would have shamed me, and not only me, but you would have shamed my American friends, and I would have suffered, and I will suffer, not only on my behalf, but also on you, because I will feel your anger and your embarrassment, because you have destroyed the collective, the group that we are now in this moment of time, and as we participate in each other's consciousness. So when doing business, you can see why the Japanese always operates as a team. Australian businessmen and women often tell me, particularly the women, they have greater pain. They tell me they walk into a room of negotiators in Tokyo, and they have a complete trip over in spite of all the briefings they have got from experts in America, Australia. Because when they walk in as an individual to conquer the world. But they see 8 Japanese men sitting there. They're operating as a team. So negotiation is based on the collective's value. It's also because of the value of reciprocity and mutuality in terms of the self. What you have here is a win-win style. It is truly the Harvard style, made famous by 2 Americans, Fisher and Urey. The win-win approach is not the sum zero approach. In other words, there can only be one winner in this room, and baby is going to be me. No, it's going to be us. Okay, it's going to be us. Well, my friends, I hope this little bit of Confucianism that I've shared with you helps you in understanding the Asians who have what I would broadly call a chopstick culture. So to be successful in business, international or otherwise, I really believe that one needs to understand the other person's culture, because that is what makes the other person and ourselves human. In understanding and being aware of the importance of our respective cultures, we begin to create synergy. We begin to create an outcome that is larger than the sum of its parts, you and me. And above all, we can start to relate to each other as human beings. When we do that, we can never lose. We are all winners to save the earth for ourselves and for our children and our children's children, not only in the Asia-Pacific Rim, but throughout the universe, because our spirit, yours and mine, will live on. And I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for that.
We have questions from Pete Hoyser, first Pete, and then Andy Sloop, and then I'm sure we'll have other questions from City Club members.
Dr. Storz, thank you for your remarks. Let's assume that I'm a Portland business person and I'm going to go over to the Far East, and I know you can't generalize about these things, but let's assume I'm going to China to do a negotiation. And I meet you at the airport and my flight leaves in 3 or 4 minutes. What might you tell me, things that I might do or I might not do or say with the Chinese hosts that I'm going to be meeting with and negotiating with on a business deal? What are some tips that you might be able to give me?
Thank you, Peter. I really like to be vertically challenged all the time, so that's why I am born only 5 feet. Okay, listeners out there, when you can't see me, I'm only 5 feet tall. Peter, if you've only got a few minutes to catch that plane, what I like to say to you is be a human being, be yourself, because you've got nice eyes, and I pick up the aura about you that you are a nice, kind, gentle American man. White, nevertheless, but nice. Okay, more seriously, when you go over to China today, Confucianism has survived, outlived communism. So we must bear that in mind. My tip to you is that go and offer friendship first from the bottom of your heart. That's not difficult for you to do, I know that. And when you get there, you spend time. Don't do the American thing with time. Don't say, I've got only 3 weeks in Beijing. I'm going to get that contract sealed, delivered, and back to the US and celebrate that. Take the time to form that friendship. It pays off in the long run. It pays off in the long run. So that would be my tip to you. Well, I'll give you my business card, and if you want more detail, you can get in touch with me, and it's only $200 an hour. I'm enjoying this.
My name is Andy Sloop with the Business and Labor Standing Committee. There's usually a separation between philosophy and pragmatism, and you've leaned more heavily towards philosophy, but the last question was fairly pragmatic. Since I like philosophy, I'm going to stick with the philosophical angle. There seems to be, well, you mentioned the importance of being human and the spiritual element in doing business with Asian countries, and there seems to be that seems to be becoming increasingly difficult to accomplish as time becomes more scarce. It's my opinion that it requires a certain amount of contemplation to understand oneself. The question is, do you agree with that there is a certain amount of self-reflection required to become human and to be more effective in business relationships? And if that's the case, is there a specific role for corporations to encourage contemplation?
Thank you, Andy. I really hear that question, and I just want to respond by saying this. To be an effective businessman or woman, to be an effective doctor, lawyer, I don't care. To be an effective mother, the first thing we have to be effective about is to be a human being first. And yes, I agree with you, it takes time, but it's time that's well spent, because if you don't go out there first as an effective human being, you ain't gonna to be a very good doctor or a marketing man or a marketing woman. It doesn't matter. So yes, I agree, it takes time, and it also takes reflection. And yes, I think when the spirit is willing, the flesh will know what to do, as they say. So once your spirit is right, even when you walk into a room like that scared, not knowing how to relate to Americans, you know what to do. Because what it is, you speak the same language. So even when you can speak Mandarin very well, for instance, when you go there without that human spirit, that humanness about you, you are not going to communicate. So the philosophy and the pragmatic aspects of doing business are closely linked together. And if I was to tell, if you were to ask me which is more important, I think that both are equally important. And if you say to me, I've only got 5 minutes, which one should I focus on? And I would say to you, focus on being a human being, because the money will come. But if you focus on making money and how to do that effectively alone, without worrying about the other part of you, you are going to lose all that money.
Hello, my name is Leslie Hildula. When you went to Australia as a young woman, I assume, what was it about their culture that you found comfortable, and what was it that you found uncomfortable?
Well, Leslie, I'm so glad you asked that question, because I'm going to stand up here for a whole month. Leslie, the most comforting thing I found about Australian culture when I arrived is finding my women friend, my first woman friend, who is a Thai woman from Thailand. And we've bonded in a tram, going to a very lonely hostel in the first week. My second comforting thing is my white Australian woman friend. At that time, she was only a girl. She was the first girl to invite me for coffee after my first seminar in this huge university where I was in despair because I was so lonely. The most uncomfortable thing was something I experienced when I went up to an Aboriginal reserve. Our Aboriginal people, I suppose, are what you would call your black people. Our black Australians are Aboriginal or Koori people, who are the indigenous people of Australia. I went up with a group of university students into a reserve to help them build houses, which you believe, I mean, that is paternalism at its worst. This is 1967, and there the most uncomfortable thing I found was racism. Because I went to a toilet in this great desert. It was only a hotel, and when I walked there, when the bus stopped, there was just, it's so isolated. No one, we were the only people with this hotel run by white Australians. I went to go to the bathroom, as you call it. We call it toilet in Australia. And there I saw a sign which says whites only, and on the other side, blacks only. And I was devastated because it was the first time I discovered I'm different and I don't know what color I am. For goodness sake, what am I going to do? I stood there for a moment, and then the anger, I was very young. I mean, 1967, I was very, very young. I just went back to the bus, and I sat there until my bladder was about to burst. I didn't go to the bathroom there, and I had to wait to another town, which is miles and miles away. So that was the most uncomfortable thing I found, literally and metaphorically.
Hi, I'm Joan Van Almen. I wondered if there are any gender cultural norms in Asia that affect relationships, and would you point some of those more significant ones out?
Joan, did you say? Joan, my darling, I want to stay in the U.S. forever to talk about that topic. Yes. Women going international, women, particularly women, American women, because I think you are far more progressive in this area of gender differences, of naming your oppression, giving it a name, sexism. You will find that the gender norms in Asia are very patriarchal. Let me give you a story, and perhaps that might answer your question to give you an idea of the enormity of it. An Australian woman comes to one of my briefings, and this is what she says. She says, I am the managing director of a company that makes high-tech medical instruments, and my husband decided to tag along with me to go to Tokyo. Her first mistake, she took a man with her. Ha! Never take a man anywhere with you when you're going to Asia if you are going to be the one in charge. She made the first mistake. She should have paid her $200 and saw me first. But she took her husband. She took her husband, and there she was. Throughout the whole business trip, the Japanese men spoke to her husband and not to her. She felt really devastated, and I don't blame her, do you? So her husband was just there for holiday, and she didn't do very much business. So how to do it is a long list, Joan. What I'm going to say to you, when in doubt, be professional. And I think that comes from one of your American books, Going International. There is a lot of dress norms, always covered neck and shoulders. And sometimes it's just also important not to make personal remarks about the business people you're dealing with, because when you're not in your culture and they're not in their culture too, when they are interacting with you, they might take that to be a sexual come on. So you might say something like, gee, you look smart today, John. And John turns around and says, hey. But it wouldn't be a John, it would be a Muhammad, or it would be a Mr. Wong, or Mr. Lim, or something. And I must share this with you. I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question because I'm so carried away with it. One of the things that we must guard against as business women is that as white American women or white Australian women, when you hit Asia, you are also going to deal with the Asian men's stereotypes of you. And what is their stereotype of you? Is the Hollywood version, baby, yeah? It is the American woman. Every American woman is a Jane Fonda or Marilyn Monroe, depending on his age group. And because they see so much of kissing and hugging on the screen, they think all American women do that too. So they would treat you differently from the way they would treat their own local women, because the norms are pretty rigid in terms of sexuality and so on. Is that helpful? I'm sorry.
Hi, Frances Portillo Denhart. I have a question about exporting, and we tend to talk about exporting products. But what about people who are wanting to export services, or as a trainer, issues around exporting ideas?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Frances. Yes, I think Frances is right, and I love that question because I told somebody I hope that it will be asked, because when I talk to business groups and I talk about exporting, we tend to think of men and products, hard stuff, goods in your hand. No, because I think you should, those of you who don't have a product to export, and you must think about exporting, is that you have a service, you have an idea, you are a lawyer like Peter, you are a lawyer like Kathleen Harron, or you are a consultant, you have consultancy expertise in your head, like Guadalupe or Cliff or whoever you are. Don't think that you can't export that. I'm a classic example. I decided when my father died that I am going back to Asia to work so I could see my mother. And so I put together, I said, I'm not going to compete. I'm not going to compete with them because they are very clever and they have the markets there already. So I put together a set of ideas I have which are based on my research on accelerated learning, or what we call whole brain learning and training, in terms of training managers and so on. One of the really important things about that is that to be effective, you got to be healthy, and you got to, and in order to remember things better and information, given the information-based society, you need to remember things really fast. So if you're relaxed and you are together, all these things will just come to you, whether it's in a stressful situation like a negotiation and so on. So I packaged this and I exported this. I'm talking about my head. I packaged my head and whatever skills I've got, and the only skill I've got, and people paid money for this, is talking. So I exported that. I took that back to Malaysia and Singapore, and I'm pleased to tell you that it has been a phenomenal success. People love it. I make money. I get all my holidays paid. I get to rest from my husband. Wow. I mean, how do you define success if that is not success? I get to make friends. So that's what I want to say to you. And I actually wrote a book and I brought it here to show you. If you want to buy it, of course, it's available. Ha-ha, that's a commercial break.
Hello, my name is Marge Kafori. I would be interested to know, if this is part of what you do, what you teach Asians about doing business with the United States. I'd like to sort of peek into our psyche a little bit and find out how you teach Asians to be effective with American business.
Okay, that's a lovely question too, and I thank you for that. And that's why my company is called Cross-Cultural Management Consultants. I don't do it just one way. I'm fairly unique. In fact, I am unique. I'm born in Muslim country, went to a Methodist mission school of Chinese Taoist, Buddhist, Confucianist upbringing, went to Australia to a Judaic-Christian culture. And when I go over to Asia and I do a workshop called Global Management, and I use this cultural perspective, which was implicit in my talk to you today, and I share with them the Judaic Christian values from which comes the business ethics of the West, the history of the West. Because it's not only cultural, but our history shapes us. I'm talking about the history of a nation. If you're American or Australian, it's just no wonder you are an individual. You place so much value on individualism. I don't need to tell you about your own history. You have to fight the frontier. You have to kill. You have to take over. You have to be violent. I don't say those things. I only say nice things about the West. I have to be so unbiased, so that people hear what I'm saying. And so I want to go for understanding of the human being on both sides. So I take that framework to Marshall, is it? Marcia or Marshall? And then I go from there to show the pragmatics. Right? When you go in and do business with Australians, remember they are from an egalitarian culture. They are not from a culture that is hierarchical. And I explain where that comes from the values deeply entrenched in our subconscious. So you don't go in and say, hey, you Australian, you change. Hey, you American, you change. No, you go in there first with understanding what are Christian, what are Judaic, what are historical forces that have shaped the white person. And then I go into a do's and don'ts because I've lived in Western culture for 28 years. I come now to American culture to learn about American culture, your business culture. And today, for me, it's just wonderful because I hear the way you ask questions, I hear the way you do things, I see the way you do things. Because I am a sociologist by profession, and what is more American than sociology? Apple pie?
Let's see if we can generate some other questions from the floor. I saw a hand up, but you need to speak from the microphone if you would like to, anyone else would like to ask a question.
Oh, you have to be. Oh.
I'm Andrew Wheeler, member. I understood from reading Kennedy's Rise and Fall of Great Powers that Confucianism turned the great power of China inward. Is there something about Confucianism that turns one inward?
Andrew, your question is there something about Confucianism that turns China inwards? Can I reread the question? When you said inwards, do you mean in relation to not wanting to go outside in the sense of xenophobia? Or do you mean introspective? Xenophobia, a fear of foreigners, or both? Both? Okay. I think historically, China has been xenophobic and also had been ethnocentrism is a very important, or was, historically. Ethnocentrism in the sense of the Middle Kingdom. The Chinese historically saw themselves as the only people between heaven and earth. And that's why they call themselves the Middle Kingdom. Is there something about Confucianism who does what you're asking? I think it's more than Confucianism. I think there are all sorts of other philosophies which I have no time to spend with you to tell you about. I think that's, so I'm going to just say the historical forces, which Confucianism is one, Taoism is another, and so on. And structural forces, the infighting and so on among Chinese. And so I said in terms of the fear of foreigners, yes, because the experiences later show that they were right. The foreigners came and they raped China, if you like, just as they raped Africa. And that is the burden that first world people, particularly Americans, British, and so on, and they have to bear, the Dutch and the French, and so on. Okay, in that sense, I would say, no, Confucianism isn't the only thing. Okay, the next part of your question is, does it help contribute to an inward looking in terms of introspection? I think it is more than Confucianism, it is also Taoism, and Taoism, or Taoism as Americans call it, is older than Confucianism. And Confucius himself says, Lao Shi, which is said to be the founder of Taoism, from which Zen Buddhism is a branch, Confucius said that Lao Tzu is the wisest man. So the introspection, the need to go inside our inner being and to create a balance, a harmony with the external environment, be it physical or social, in this case people, comes, I think, more from Taoism.
Andy Sloop, City Club. I'm going to be greedy here and ask another question, if I could. Again, going back to the values that impact the way, the ability of Americans to do business with with Asians. I just came earlier today from a conference related to environmental technology and exporting environmental services, which is projected to be a very important industry for Oregon and for the Pacific Northwest. Can you talk a little bit about the values and philosophical forces that may or may not affect demand for these types of exported products and services?
So your company, you're talking about environmental services, and what are the forces that might impact on that coming from the value space of Confucianism?
Right, particularly regard for nature and the environment.
I think as an American man, and the work that you're doing and the sound of your voice, I think you already have good spirits in you. And you would be hurt when you get to China or anywhere of Asia. So you got to guard against that, because the pollution and the rape of the environment is so powerful that my insides ache when I'm over there. Someone said to me, a whole generation of Chinese children will never, ever see blue skies. So I would like to say to you, whatever good, whatever things that you can do, you do it, and do it with all the good power that comes from being an American white male. Because if anything anyone can do that would help the ecological and environment problems of Asia, it will have to come from the most powerful nation on this earth, and that is the USA. Because similarly, because you have made some of the biggest mistakes, because you were given the time to make them. So, yes, the values which are now business values of its most wicked, evil phase are operating in parts of Asia, in particular China, because to be Western is to be modern, unfortunately. To be Western is to be American. So what's going to happen to the values that I'm talking about are idealistic values. All of you are intelligent enough to realize what I've painted for you is the philosophy, the values. Just as Christianity gives you good values, but when you go out into the street, you will be cheated, you will be smacked around, and they're not Christian values. So just as you go into Asia to do business, what you've got is an ideal type or a measuring rod from what I said, a yardstick. A yardstick that you hold in your head. When you go in there and you say, yeah, that's the Confucianist ethic. But what are the forces of modernization that have shaped the person in front of you in blood and flesh? He may cheat you, she may not. But when you go in there, these are the values that are coming from all directions. And they may not be spiritual values, but they may be the values of naked, rampant, evil capitalism. And I mean that in all seriousness. There are two faces to every paradigm, every ideology. It is up to us, men and women, to use that for the good of mankind. You drive a car. One day it is a means of transport. Another day it is a weapon. It is up to us to use that tool. So what I've given you in terms of the spiritual values of Asia, in particular Chinese culture, in the form of Confucianist ethic or Taoist beliefs, that you keep in your heart, because it's not that different from the Judeo-Christian values. But how you cope with what you're doing in terms of environmental services is first acknowledge and recognize that's going to hurt your heart, and then you do business. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but
Well, you want me to give you a follow-up question?
Could I have a follow-up question on that? Have I
Actually,
got time?
We have about 2 to 3 minutes, and I think we have a speaker standing. If you could do one last question and one last answer, unless you do wish to expand a little
Well,
bit.
I tell you what would be a good thing. If you have no time, can I talk to you at the reception? That would be good, because I see here someone from my own culture, and I want to hear his question.
First time, can you tell me that whether I'm Chinese or Japanese or Korean or whatever? Because we know that Asians are not just Asian; they are, from all different countries and peoples. Actually, I'm interested in your comparison between the Chinese and Japanese culture. Mainly, you can name a couple of major differences and similarity between these two cultures or between these two peoples.
Mhm. First of all, I cannot tell whether you're Japanese, Australian, Korean, or American. But I acknowledge that we are from the same race, anthropologically speaking. The same race as your Native Americans, and I believe also the Eskimos. We belong to what anthropologists call Mongoloid race. Okay, that's all I can say about that first part. What are the major differences between the Japanese and the Chinese culture at the moment? The Chinese culture is not singular but plural. It depends on whether you're Chinese from mainland China or whether you're Chinese as a la overseas Chinese from Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. So I must acknowledge there are differences even between the Chinese culture. So to answer your question, the major difference between the Japanese culture and the Chinese culture, I'm talking about it globally, is the Japanese people have a culture that is still very formally adhering to Confucianist values in terms of the process of becoming a human being. They pay close attention to the ritualization of their body. So therefore, the way they exchange business cards has an inbuilt cultural value. The way they bow. Exchanging business card between Japanese is very important because they have to see where your position is, whether you're a managing director or a secretary, so that they know how to put their bow, whether it's lower or higher or just middle, to you. So it reflects a very hierarchical culture. The mainland Chinese do not have such a formal bow. So that's a major difference in terms of the manifestation of behavior. Because there's more formality. Another major difference is culturally, the Japanese is still very much a very tight group to the extent that you can call them a team when you are having social interaction with them. It's very difficult to be an insider. I think for the Chinese in Singapore and in Malaysia, that is easier. So that's a major difference. Another major difference, I think, finally lies in terms of the overseas Chinese culture and the Japanese is the overseas Chinese, Thai Chinese, Filipino, and so on. We are more open to doing a business with women, but not the Japanese patriarchal business culture.
You can see we could learn more and more from our speaker, and actually we're very fortunate that her hosts today have planned a reception to which City Club members are invited to adjourn to on the third floor in the Forum Suite if you wish to continue this conversation. But I know you will join me in thanking Dr. Moni Lai Storz, and if I may say so, I believe that you are a very good human being too. Thank you. We're adjourned.